This was a difficult one to work through because, and I will admit, I'm doing this without notes. So please note, the reason I'm doing this without notes is I've done it with notes and it's either come in at 30 minutes, which is too short and didn't cover anything like I wanted. It was literally bullet points. Or came in the final recording was some region of 3.5 hours long. And as much as I love YouTube and I love all the audience I have out here and I love the people who watch this stuff, there aren't going to be many of you who are going to watch a 3.5 hour video. And I want people to watch it to see enough of it that they go away with some interesting ideas. And so I thought, well, I'm going to try and do this like I do lecture style. I've got a time in my mind. 2-hour lecture slot usually works out at roughly a 90 minutes presentation. Roughly a 90 minutes presentation. And that is what I am, roughly speaking, aiming for. Before people ask, why does 2 hours work out? Because you need roughly 10 minutes for the students to arrive because they come in late. And at the end you need time for questions. So it works out at roughly 90 minutes for a 2-hour slot. So what were the most serious mistakes made in World War II based on World War I experience? Why was this so tough to put together? Well, because you can either go down to a granular level, in which case almost every mistake in World War II can be categorized off to World War I experience and World War I, knowledge, understanding. Or you have to treat it at an almost superficial level. Getting in between is the trick. And it's the point at which useful analysis comes in. Because at the granular level, you're basically providing people with excuses. I could put a picture of Adolf Hitler up here and go, yes, well, because of his service in World War I, he becomes what he becomes, and therefore the whole of World War II is the fault of World War I. Yeah, that doesn't sound much fun to me either. And one of the things I've noticed recently with videos is if I start to talk on slightly broader themes, and the slightly what I would normally consider more, how do I put this politely? More abstract levels, it bores people. You need the abstract levels because they provide the structure, but it bores people. Whenever I see a comment, and I do see the comments, and sometimes I go, I don't agree with it, or sometimes I do agree with it. There was a comment recently on a video which said, interesting topic, very boring presentation. And I was sort of going, well, it wasn't, but the thing is, you're wanting it presented at a level at which, in the nicest way, it would become an entire series. And there is an idea in my mind for various topics which I will go back and actually would like to do a series about in the future. I have a running commentary in my head whenever I'm looking at videos and whenever I go back and actually watch any of my own videos, and sometimes I go, oh, I covered that quite well, but oh, I could do that in detail and that and more. And I have a feeling this one is going to be one of those. But as said, it could either be done at the granular level, or it can be at the supremely abstract level. And I'm trying to shoot for in between. So we'll see how well I do. But, yeah. The trouble is there are a lot of mistakes to pick from. There really are. But there is also the fact, and this must not be overstated, but also cannot be understated, World War II is a very different war to World War I. World War One is a European war with some interesting excerpts going on outside it. But it involves a lot of nations from all around the world, so it becomes a world war. World War Two is a global war. Europe might start it, but it doesn't finish it. It might be central to it, but that's more because of the connections of the various nations in a very global system. And yeah, shock horror for anyone who doesn't realise this, we've been running on a global system for a long, long time. Globalism and all these modern phraseologies which go around it and sound like great buzzwords, they're just a new coat of paint on a system which has been around for a very long time. Very, very long time. Shameless book plug. But here was the interesting thing. Here you can argue is your first mistake of World War II based on World War One. Because the smaller destroyers, the torpedo-focused, the smaller destroyers, they are lovely. They really are. And yeah, they step up and they do a massive amount of work and nothing should detract from that. But the larger destroyers, which in World War II are sort of taking the place of the small light cruisers which have been functioning with those destroyer forces, like the Harwich Force, they're essential. And the fact that not more of them have been built prior to World War II, or even ordered prior to World War II, than were, that's a mistake. That's people looking back at World War I and going, mass torpedo attacks. See, that happened at Jutland, that happened there. Mass torpedo attack. We have to have the mass. We have to have the numbers of ships. The volume. And you do want the volume. You need the volume. But those destroyers also need guns. Because one of the lessons that's been forgotten in this scenario is that those destroyers, those mass torpedo attacks, took place under cover of often massed battleships in battle lines, which are far bigger and more dominant in World War I than they are in World War II. They are far bigger and far more dominant. But still, they're good books. It's a good book. Hopefully at least one other will come out. Self-published at least. Will come out this year. If everything holds and the paychecks turn up when they're supposed to, the pictures will be procured. But we can't do anything in terms of this discussion without setting first a criteria. So, what are the criteria? Well, the decision has to be not more than 2 steps removed from World War I experiences being based on. So, this actually causes some interesting points to come up. What do I mean by 2 steps? Well, I mean that preferably it's 1 step. Preferably there is literally command documents going, well, you know, this is what we did in this prior war, so we're going to do it this way. There's a very good example which involves this gentleman. There's a reason I've got him pictured up here. Look, please, no one consider me being slagging off Churchill. When I say he's the best of the options we have available in 1939, I do not say that lightly. Unlike some commentators who I swear believe other people are going to pop out of thin air. No, of the actual viable options for being Britain's leader in 1939, there are 3. And of them, by the far the best option is Winston Churchill. By a country mile. So, he's good. But he is also human. And this is something that's sometimes misunderstood by people, because the amount of times I will see people look at leadership and go, they made a mistake, they're a terrible leader. Are they also a human being? Yeah. So, human beings are perfect? No, they're not. Well, then why do you expect a leader who is a human to be perfect? Why? Well, they're supposed to be, because they're the leader. No. There is no perfection. And in the nicest way, leadership is often about making the least worst decision, and going with the least worst option, not about going with the best. You can have on your list an entire amount of beautiful resources, but where are those resources? Where is the problem? Can you get those resources from point A to point B to probably point C, where the problem is? Or do you have other issues? How many problems are you juggling at that time? So, yeah. And it's very popular amongst some people to spend their entire time basically spamming his leadership. But he's the best of the options we have available. And he gets more right than he gets wrong. And I know there is just as much a strong theme in post-World War II British historiography as there is in post-World War II German historiography, where all the mistakes are blamed on the leadership and all the good things are down to them. Which is why I love Cunningham's Sailor Odyssey so much, because he doesn't do that. He does say he sparred with Churchill on a regular basis. He's open about that. Doesn't blame him. It's not the problem. But there are quite a lot of generals who will write this sort of line of, oh yes, this brilliant thing, I came up with that. This bad thing I did. Well, that was all Churchill. No, it wasn't. I'm sorry, it wasn't. But we'll get more into leadership in a little bit. So, mistakes we're looking are things which are either directly a result of World War I experience, or they come about because of how World War I experience has been used to shape what's been set up. So that's the second order effect. So it's either World War I experience created the circumstances that it happened, or World War I experience led to it actually happening. So you have to be able to draw a direct line. That is the criteria. That is what we're going with. And hopefully, it works for you. Which leads us to, if the end button can't be blamed on World War I. Okay. So, usually at this point, someone's going, when used inappropriately, they had a nasty habit of going boom. But, if used appropriately, were very effective. It's the same with, in this picture, we have, of course, the Graf Spee. And again, when a surface radar is used effectively, it can be very effective and tie up a lot of British resources, a lot of other navies' resources. It's brilliant. However, it's also a glass cannon, and when it's cornered, it gets snookered. I.e., Coronel happens, and Coronel, yay, Spee wins. Falkland Islands happens. Oh, frigate. Because ultimately, when you're a small power fighting a larger power, you can score some great victories. But you're probably not going to score enough to change the balance, and they're always going to be able to bring in far more resources than you have. Sir Deutschland class. Can't be blamed on World War I. Honestly, it can't. And neither can battlecruisers. They're around a long time before World War One. They showed their good points and their bad points in World War One. People learnt the mistakes, learnt the lessons, and still decided to take a punt on it because, honestly, it's your best option for building a rounded fleet capable of inflicting something on your opponents. Capable of inflicting something on your opponents. It's not necessarily a lot, but it's something. So there's an example. Can't be blamed on World War One. However, there are misunderstood lessons of World War One, and this one is one of the ones which really, I would say, bites a lot of people. The example I'm using here in the picture, in the sort of the picture terms, is the submarines. The most successful German submarines in World War One were the mine-laying submarines. Pound for pound, they took out far more Allied shipping than torpedo and guns. And they would occasionally use torpedoes and guns themselves, but they would lay a lot of mines. And the thing was, that was kind of a very safe option for them. You lay a minefield, you go home. You maybe don't see the enemy the entire time you're there, but you cost them some ships possibly, or you at least take up a lot of their time trying to how do I put this politely, clear the minefield, which can impact on shipping and cause delays and issues in movement of people and goods. It's just never-ending second and third order effects. But the thing is, lessons of World War One are the power of the submarine, but also there's this sort of virtue of them, using their guns, using their torpedoes. And you can argue, from a Wolfpack perspective, it makes sense. Because it's far easier to go and engage with guns and torpedoes than to lay some mines. But let's put it this way. America has a huge amount of trouble dealing with the onset of submarine warfare because they don't have enough vessels to do convoy escort. Imagine if those long-range submarines had been laying minefields outside of American harbours. Maybe they'd also carried some torpedoes and done some happy time taking out of surface vessels using guns and torpedoes, but also they carried a lot of mines and actually been grown-up, matured, mine-laying submarines that could have been developed. The second, third, fourth order effects and complications caused by that mine warfare would have been massive. Massive. We are very lucky, in terms of the Allies, in World War II, that the Germans are always seem to be chasing, despite their often marketed obsession with engineering and science, are always chasing the honourable, the élan, the glorious way of fighting a war. Because if they had really done the statistical analysis of World War One, they would have been prepared for mine warfare, and they would have been laying a lot of mines. And one of the interesting problems for Britain when it comes to World War Two, and this is another issue which is, you could say, as a consequence of World War One, is that they're actually better prepared in their mobilization for mine warfare than anti-submarine long-range escort warfare. They're building the escorts, but they have a lot of minesweepers they've called up and they've brought into service. Why? Because the British have done the statistical analysis, because the guy who's the third Sea Lord from 1933 to 1939 when he dies, Admiral Henderson, had actually written the paper in World War One, which A, brought in convoying, and was used to justify bringing in convoying within the Admiralty, but also had looked at the statistical damage done by mine warfare and had caused a threefold expanse in the mine warfare, the mine sort of hunting capability, the mine clearing capability of the Royal Navy, because they quickly realised, Our big problem are that our harbours keep getting chocked up. And these chocking ups cause delays in convoys forming up, or cause us to have to split convoys, or ships aren't able to sail together as for protection. And that puts more strain on our escort force. Which means we either have less escorts or no escorts per convoy. And that causes problems. Mine warfare has a huge amount of impact on naval warfare. It's massively problematic for navies to deal with, even to this day. And this is not the only lesson of World War I which is misunderstood. There are lots of lessons which are misunderstood. The big one, I would say, is unit firepower. And again, you get into this. Rapidly in World War I, unit firepower at the lowest level has to increase. The number of machine guns, number of mortars, number of squad weapons increases dramatically. It has to deal with the demand. Well, in World War II, we have to end up relearning that lesson. Slowly, but we relearn it. Because again, firepower is useful. It's better to expend things than people. It's a lesson which we learn almost every single war. You start off with people firing, well, we're going to fire only to engage and take down our opponents. Well, at a certain point, firing for suppression becomes a big factor. If you consider today with our modern missile warfare, in terms of how we use it for air defense, etc., we're always talking about engaging and taking out targets. Because we do not have modern weapons which are designed to just suppress the enemy. Not in air attack, air defense role, not in many roles. Whereas if you consider in World War II, suppression of enemy aircraft was pretty much the role of the heavy AA guns, and you could argue the medium AA guns as well. It was almost more important than actually engaging a target was to be suppressing the area, so much to throw the target off, to make them have to jink and jive to avoid you and avoid the fire. So misunderstood lessons of World War I. Now, here is a really interesting thing. Do you know where the absolute best set of wargaming models in the world for fighting a battle of for doing a war game of the Battle of Jutland is? Annapolis, U.S. Naval Academy. The U.S. Navy spent a humongous amount of time after World War I and before World War II refighting Jutland. Going through it time after time after time. Same with Japan. It's a really conversely strange thing. Or rather, conversely, it's really strange that, in contrast, the Royal Navy doesn't. The Royal Navy really doesn't. They should do. They should spend a lot of time looking over Jutland, but honestly, the Royal Navy looks for it, thinks about it, drops it. And you can sort of see why. Germany for Britain was the threat across the North Sea, which added heat to the competition when you had the Anglo-German naval race, which was the quantitative race of the dreadnought races, not the qualitative race, which was, as I've said before, America, Japan, Britain, and Italy. It's always fun when you say those four and people go, "What? Yeah." All four of those are in the qualitative race, very much so. And I would say Austro-Hungary gets a far bigger, far closer to being in that race, but they don't produce that often, than actually Germany, Imperial Germany does, in terms of the qualitative race. Because Austria-Hungary is more likely to push a step forward, and push things a step forward, than the Imperial Germany is. But for Britain, that means with Germany gone, what's the next war going to be like? It's going to be a mobile war. So studying Jutland doesn't really help. They're either going to be fighting powers which are smaller than them in the Mediterranean, maybe Italy or something like that, but that's so much smaller than them that frankly they can turn up and swamp it. And they'll probably have France alongside them as well, so that'll just mean they'll be massively outnumbering the Italians. Or they're fighting a global war, probably against Japan. Very quickly it's realised that the two erstwhile allies are possibly also the two most likely threats to British Empire, to the security of the Empire. So you have to quickly work through going, well, is Jutland a likely scenario for us in either of those circumstances? No. Potentially versus the Japanese, you could argue, but again, Britain is going to outnumber, especially thanks to the treaty system, their battleships. And Britain also doesn't expect the Japanese to be that silly. They expect them to do a version of attrition warfare, so the British are expecting to not have to deal with the battleships till they get very close to Japan. And the British also have the most aircraft carriers of any nation operating in the 1920s and 30s. That basically means their approach to a refighting battle line scenario is different, because they do massive exercises and they test it out, and they don't get everything right. Please don't. We'll get into that. They don't get everything right. But the USN and IJN, in contrast, they're sitting and looking at fighting each other. And honestly, they come down to Jutland / Tashima, and sometimes in the Japanese case, because they are thinking about fighting each other. And both of them have a need to prove themselves. The Japanese want to show once and for all they are a powerful nation. Yes, they defeated Russia, but anyway, after they defeated them, everyone's looking around and going, yeah, that's... It's like defeating Fred. You know, Fred, he's annoying. He always looks big and bulky, but honestly, everyone can defeat him. It's just, yeah. It's just Fred. Doesn't mean anything. And their threat this time is a nation which they consider far scarier than Russia ever was, because of their history with them. It's one of those things. You have to remember, the Spanish-American War has an impact on a lot of nations, and especially on some of the eastern nations which are just forming. From a European perspective, especially from a major power perspective, it's a case of, oh, America's beating up the small powers. Oh, they're beating up Spain. Oh, they were annoying anyway. Okay, carry on. From the Dutch perspective, it's frigate. Because they're looking at the Spanish and going, we're not dissimilar in circumstance here, you and I, with our empires. We are a small nation. We are economically far more vibrant than the Spanish are at this point, so it's time. But we're also a small nation with a distant empire, which is very close to a certain big power, which seems to be occasionally going through bouts of both very pleasant, almost pacifism, to overt expansionism. It's amazing. And then there's the Japanese, who are going, everyone else around us is a colony. The Chinese are collapsing. We don't like them anyway. And you have kept turning. You have literally beaten us up to have the right to trade with us. Yeah. So add that into the mix, and the Japanese are basically seeking a glorious war in some regards, in terms of if they fight it, and fighting another big action in the middle of the Pacific. Well, that's not really where they want to be fighting it. They want to get again. Their plan, which both Britain and America work out, is the Japanese plan. It's really not a complicated doctrine or idea to work out, because once you look at their situation, it's the best thing they can do is to attrit as you get closer, and then once you reach roughly parity, or preferably slightly below parity for what they're able to bring, they turn up and beat you in a glorious battle, and then hopefully they then get to set the tone of the negotiations, and a negotiated peace comes about. Not you go away, rebuild, come back twice as strong. That's just that just they hope doesn't happen, because if that happens, they've got no chance. They can do it maybe once. Once they can make you suffer. And to an extent, the Japanese are looking at Jutland from the perspective of the Germans. How do you hold off that major power? Whereas the Americans are looking at it from the perspective of the British and going, why did you fail to crush this power? The British have already learned a lesson and going, well, our shells were absolutely and a guy called Beatty was in charge of the battle cruisers. Those two things together basically turned the battle from being a slam dunk to being a oh sugar. Strategic win, arguably a who owns the field after the battle win, but dang, we lost more ships. But also there's the fact that some of the German ships did actually touch bottom due to damage on the going home. So it becomes interesting. So I've already seen in my various comment section on some videos of people going, oh, does this consider them sunk or not? The thing is, most of them get floated up by the work of their own crew and get home, so we're not going to go with sunk. We're not on that one. But the thing is, the fact it happened shows how much of a close-run thing it was. And if the British had better shells, and someone had actually bothered to tell Jellicoe what was going on, rather than just got involved in trying to fight their own little war and then realizing they were going to get themselves, well, smackdowned, things would have been a lot better for the British. Theories of warfare that came out of World War I. World War One. Sorry for a bit of a gap there, but we've been joined by a fluffy research assistant who was absent earlier. The theories of warfare that came out of World War One were intoxicating. They really were. And they had a big impact on the 1920s and 30s. The idea the bomber will always get through doesn't just come from Stanley Baldwin. It doesn't even just come from Gilio Duhay, although he is by and far and away the most obvious, most central and foundational proponent in terms of the written word and the convincing argument of the theory of strategic bombing. Although his argument was always that they're going to be bombers dropping 100 tons worth of biological warfare bombs that are going to decimate cities. If he'd known the nuclear bomb was going to be developed, he'd have been very pro its use. The thing is, though, that kind of mixed with the issues with intercepting Gophers and Zeppelins over the UK, and it did come up with some of these ideas that bombers couldn't be intercepted. Now, of course, the reality is that humanity is nothing if not creative, and that for everything we create, we tend to create a counter or an offset or something else, which means that things don't go quite to the plan. You want to have an easy win? Don't go up against humanity with something humanity's thought of. They will tend to also already be thinking of a counter to it. In this case, radar. You know, it's one thing to say the bomb will always get through, as long as you can't detect and prepare for the aircraft coming through. The moment you can detect the aircraft, it's kind of like the moment you can name something. The moment you can name and identify a threat, well, you're half of the way there to working out how to deal with that threat. In the case of bombers, it's fighters, it's surface-to-air missiles, it's other forms of air defense. And those things are all enabled by the development of radar. So, these are all the theories of warfare that come out of World War I, and there are lots of theories. Lots and lots of theories. We can talk about Blitzkrieg. But let's be honest, a lightning war, rapid movement, that is something which we'll get into, because it is both understood and misunderstood. And one of the interesting things about that is the way it is misunderstood. But the really big theory of impact for us, especially from a naval perspective, is the idea the bomber will always get through. Because in the United Kingdom, that led directly to the creation of the very heavy predominance of the Strategic Bombing Command and Bomber Command in the Royal Air Force. Led to the Air Ministry, which was always more of a political organisation than the Royal Air Force. Please note that. You have to draw a bit of a line between them, like you draw a little bit of a line between the Admiralty and the Royal Navy as the wider organisation, because they're the political wing, and the political wings are always slightly different. So the Air Ministry becomes very focused on the bomber force, mainly because lots of politicians are obsessed with it. Hello. And with lots of politicians being obsessed with it, it's very good for funding. But it does mean that as a whole, the Air Ministry is not very good when it comes to things like investing in single-engine aircraft. This is one of the problems which causes issues with the development of engines in Britain. In terms of, there is the whole secret horsepower race that was published recently. A good book was published on that one, but it's not really so secret in that there's quite a lot of stuff going on, and it's quite well known that there was a bit of horsepower race going on. But honestly, that has limits. The horsepower race has limits. Hello, you want up in that. And if you put more into it, if you were putting more into the single-engine aircraft. Single-engine aircraft, the individual engine's horsepower matters more than a multi-engine aircraft. Multi-engine aircraft, well, you're stacking up the horsepower of multiple engines. Yes, you're also stacking up the weight of multiple engines, but, you know, it all evens out as being useful. And the thing is, sorry, I keep saying the thing is, but in my defense, I keep getting elbowed in the stomach by a very bony elbow. Okay, I'll be careful. The thing is, with Fleet Air Arm aircraft, they are single-engined aircraft. They are single-engined aircraft. And as such, you need to have as much power in that engine as possible. In fact, you need more power than the single-engined aircraft operating from shore, because Fleet Air Arm aircraft are always going to be heavier. For starters, they have to be built more structurally firm, because they take part in the controlled accident that is landing on an aircraft carrier deck. You land on an aircraft deck, carrier deck, you're basically smashing in. You're basically doing a controlled crash. It's not like landing on a runway. It's not like landing on an airfield where basically the Earth isn't moving. Not in a way you can really discern when you're impacting. But ships, they're going up, down, left, right, or rather port and starboard. They're moving forward usually. It's an impact when you hit. And sometimes they rise up to meet you. Sometimes they drop down and you've hit them lower. That you sink for further than you thought you were, and you come back up again. It's great fun. But it all has an impact on what you need from your aircraft. So they tend to be heavier, which means for a similar power to weight ratio, they need a lot more power. Which again usually requires a heavier engine as well. just a never-ending virtuous circle of problems when you're designing carrier aircraft. The fact that they are so useful, well, just makes it more important you get it right. Pace of warfare. This is one of those interesting things because it's often put as, oh, it was post-World War I, we come up with these ideas. No. The really interesting campaign is the 100 Days campaign in 1918, the Allied offensive. The logistics and all the things that go into that to make it as fast as it possibly can. That offensive is absolutely overwhelming for the Germans to deal with. It's pushing them back. It's pushing them back hard. And the fact is the Germans start negotiating before the Allies reach Germany, which is where you get the stab in the back theory. If perhaps the Allies had actually reached and breached Germany, maybe more people would have accepted that they had been militarily defeated. But it's far nicer to have the dream that you weren't defeated than face the reality that by the end of World War I, the German army had been as hobbled and as crippled as the French army was. And you were dealing with floods of British and American troops, or rather British Empire troops and American troops coming through. The British were there in large numbers, but the British also brought the Canadians, the Australians, the Indians. Every group they could grab were coming along for the fun. You know, the British Empire has this rule. When it's a party, they bring everyone. There's never a small party with the British Empire around. But the point about all this is the pace of warfare. The pace of... Thank you. The pace of warfare. Please note, before anyone complains in this video about me having my dog here, everyone else has gone out, so I have the poodle. So I either leave him on his own in the house or have him in here with me, and he's happier on my lap because it's raining outside and there's a bit of a thunderstorm, so yeah. So apologies, but this is when I have to record this video, and this boy doesn't like thunderstorms, so he's in my lap and being a bit rambunctious. Now, the pace of warfare had sped up. What was achieved in the 100 Days campaign was nothing compared to what a fully motorized, mechanized army could have achieved. And all the powers learn this. But the thing is, not all the powers are able to implement it. It's one of those cruel things of fate that, or twists of fate, let's say, that the British are the only fully mechanized and motorized army in the world in 1939. I'm sorry, the Germans depended on a lot of horses to move a lot of their logistics, and even some of their infantry. It's just... they haven't got that. And by the way, they haven't been able to start themselves up to get there. But what happens with the British, of course, is that people get to their positions and they start digging trenches. Why? Because everyone's remembering not the pace of the end of World War I. They're not remembering the 100 Days campaign. They're not remembering what happened in the last few months of the war when tanks and aircraft and all the different pieces of technology came together and they were surging ahead. No, they're remembering the years before that. The stalemate. The defensive torpor that overtook so much of Europe. And also because the Allies are obsessed with doing a counterattack. It's kind of like the Schlieffen Plan from World War I, in that the Allies have this idea that they have their forces spread out, the Germans are going to attack in this place, The Allies will hold, respond, and push them back and win. Great. Then the Germans, A, don't attack them in place they're supposed to attack. B, the French don't have the radios, so they don't know where the Germans are attacking quickly enough to respond to it in a way that could have actually turned that into a nightmare. And C, everyone forgot the enemy gets a vote. On both sides. It's completely accurate history. So, the final, rather, of these sort of more abstract ones. We'll get into more personal ones as we go on, but neutrality protects. If you're looking at Norway, if you're looking at Netherlands, in World War II, both nations are placing a hefty emphasis on neutrality protecting them. There's a reason those nations were as keen and happy to join NATO as they were. There's a reason Norway has been one of the most ardent members of NATO for its entire history of the alliance. Because neutrality after World War II didn't protect them. Neutrality had protected World War I. In World War I, being a neutral nation, yes, they'd had the British forcibly purchasing all supplies which might be going from them to Germany. And when I say forcibly purchasing, the British had given the choice of, we will pay twice as much money as the Germans will, or we will take it at the point of a gun. The Norwegians basically went, so we get 100+% pure profit, or we get to have deal with guns. We'll take the profit. Interesting to note, the exception to all this, of course, was Sweden, which was the most heavily armed neutral power of anyone. And, of course, Switzerland as well. Both of them have maintained a history of being fairly heavily armed for their size. Yes, Switzerland is mostly a mountain range, and Lord help anyone who tries to invade it, because whilst you might think you have the numbers, you'll quickly find out that mountain valleys and mountainsides sap up strength like a sponge saps up water. Not sure what he's up to now. In the case of Sweden, well, they like a mixture of heavily armed warships, a very, very active and very mobilized reserve force, and a lot of investment in defense research, which meant that their equipment tends to be not just top-notch, but a notch above top-notch. Because, you see, they don't have to afford the very large runs of the massive powers, but they can afford to invest in the technology of that equivalent to the massive powers, because they mostly sell it to them. And they sell them the version they're prepared to sell to other people, not the version they necessarily have themselves. Neutrality didn't protect in World War II. You weren't dealing with that world anymore. You could argue World War I was the end of the chivalrous age, of the age of honour in war, but frankly it had gone long before then. The reality was, World War I is the reality of conflict in the wider world. I.e. conflict in what should be taking place in Africa and Asia. Coming back to Britain, well, not just Britain, but to the rest of Europe. I'm not sure where I was going with Britain there, but to be fair, Britain and France have been inflicting that kind of war on pretty much everyone for the last 2-3 centuries. Other nations have got involved, but Britain and France were the two big ones really going around and taking what they wanted. Often in pursuit of fighting each other. The amount of territory in the world which was swallowed up by those two nations, literally so the other couldn't have it, is absurd. That was their reasoning. But again, this is a lesson of World War One. A lesson of World War One was neutrality protects. You could argue the moment Denmark's invaded, Norway should have done like Sweden and activated all their defences and gone mobilise, mobilise, mobilise. But they didn't. If they had, the odds are Norway doesn't fall to the German invasion. Because honestly, the German invasion is the most on a wing and a prayer invasion you have ever seen once you start going into its details. It sounds really good, right up until you realise, well, hang on, when just one fort was prepared to fire, they lost a heavy cruiser. If all the forts and all the other defences had been mobilised, if all the ships had been prepared, if all the garrisons had been activated, who knows what they'd have accomplished. And yes, people then turn around and go, well, you know, there are these people who were garrison commanders, etc., in points A and point B, who turned over and started helping the Germans. Yeah. But it's far more difficult to be a garrison commander doing that when there's been a general mobilisation. And you've got a second in command and a senior NCO all looking and going, sir, that's the Germans trying to invade our country. I think we should hold our fire. Sir, they're invading our country. I think we should hold fire. Sir, you are now relieved the command. That's the problem. If you do a slow mobilisation, or not a partial mobilisation, you are far more prone to problems of individuals than if you've done a general mobilisation. Because that means enough people alerted and enough people are on duty that they will look at that person and go, what are you doing? And again, this comes into the whole pace of warfare thing. Because war had moved really quickly at the end of World War One. And neutrality, again, you can afford to slow walk to mobilisation if your neutrality protects you and if you think the war's going to take months, years to reach you. But when it can reach you in hours, days, you can't slow walk these things. I know, I used the W word. You find that worrying, but bear with me. You'll get one later. So neutrality, it didn't protect. There is, of course, another interesting example, which I haven't brought up, which, of course, is Spain, which neutrality did protect her. Because she's a fascist dictatorship. But Britain, America, none of the Allies considered going into her. Iceland gets occupied by Britain. But Spain, no. She gets left. And there are good reasons for that. One, Spain is an absolute nightmare to try and invade. Let's be honest. It's just been through a civil war. It's been bashed up completely. There's no real advantage through invading it. But secondly, there's also the fact that a neutral Spain actually serves both sides' interests, really. Whilst, to an extent, you can argue that especially after the invasion of after D-Day and the invasion of France and the sort of the liberation of France by the Allies, you could argue that maybe if the Spanish army had charged up from the Pyrenees and just, you know, gone north into France, that could have helped the Germans for like 5 minutes before the Allies turned around and squashed whatever Spanish troops had actually managed to come out of Spain at that point. But no, there's no real advantage to either side to Spain actually getting involved in the war. And so, they're not. But the thing is, that's a hard question to work out as a country. Is it advantageous for you to be involved in the war? Is it advantageous for your territory to be used in the war? If so, then your neutrality is not going to protect you. So basically, neutrality is a protection at the convenience of the warring parties, not at the convenience of the nations which declare neutrality. Okay, so leadership. Well, I've already started touching on this with talking about Winston Churchill earlier, but there's a lot of issues. A lot of issues in various leadership positions. A lot of issues. Mainly to do with, well, the leaders you've got actually in charge. The vast majority of them are World War I veterans. including this gentleman. That is General Pershing. That is then Brigadier General MacArthur. That was when he was very good in World War I. Unfortunately, he was also broken by World War I. Mistakes caused by World War I, and we've been over the fact that it has to be either the conditions of World War I caused mistakes in World War II, or the actual basis of it is going on World War I information when you make a decision. Well, it's hard to consider some of the leadership and some decisions made by various leaderships in World War II is not a result of their World War I experience. You could even argue that the failure of deterrence, or rather, the failure to try and properly prepare, is a legacy of World War I. World War I has a huge impact on World War II, despite it being completely different. The leadership, in this case we've got MacArthur, but you could pick almost any general, any admiral, any Air Force officer, and you could point to a World War I officer. You could point to someone who had earned their first experience fighting in the Great War, and who'd been part of the generation who had really believed, for a large number of them, that World War I, as we now call it, as they call it, the Great War, or the war to end all wars, was the last big war. Admittedly, that piece of hubris was quickly dealt with. But it's kind of like the treaty system. When I talk about the treaties, and people sometimes accuse me of thinking that if they'd made the treaties more equitable, it would have stopped war happening. No. It wouldn't. Human nature means that war turns up. But the thing is, equitable treaties tend to change the sides of wars. They tend to change the nature of wars. Imagine World War II if it's broken up into two separate wars. Or if it's free. Or if different sides don't join in. Or if the fact that you've actually had some rearmament going on under the equitable treaty system, under an equitable treaty system, the dictatorships raise the bar even further they want to get to before they're prepared to actually start a war, which gives more time for the countries which haven't had their infrastructure destroyed by war and by treaty to actually grow their infrastructure even more. All these things have an impact. Well, it's just the same as second, third order effects of World War I. The leadership, the impressions created by World War I, by their victories and their battles in World War I, have an impact. They really do. They create a situation whereby you are dealing with officers who have a legacy. MacArthur's image is not created by World War II. It's already been created. MacArthur is living off the memory of him in the First World War. And he grows this in the Second World War. Despite many, many issues. Many, many issues, which would have honestly... if you consider Britain, there is almost a tendency among, especially with Churchill, but with other senior leaders in the UK, to can leaders too quickly. There are perfectly good generals who fall from grace and are dismissed from the North African campaign just because actually they found that when you send off half their army to fight in Greece and that gets crumpled up there, they aren't able to complete the mission they wanted to do in North Africa with their full army because they don't have the full army. You know, there are all sorts of issues which happen because commanders fail. If you consider MacArthur and the Philippines, it's hard to argue he would have, how do I put this, still been in post if he hadn't been as politically powerful as he was. And the thing is, there are other officers like this going around. The UK has a few. Goodness knows there's the Lord Cork and yeah. I'm not going to start on him again, but there are officers. And there are officers in Germany. There's Hermann Goering is a classic example. He's a World War I fighter ace, all these things. He is absolutely frigating useless. And every mistake you can play that he makes, you can place on the actual World War I mantra and his entire perception created to him by World War I. So, pausing carrier and capital ship construction. Well, here's the thing. There are two reasons this is wrong. One, when Churchill decides to do this, when he becomes First Lord of the Admiralty, it's based on his experience from World War I when there wasn't an escort program already going, so the Royal Navy needed to stop building carriers and capital ships, or rather capital ships at the time, to get an escort program actually going. Of course, as I've said on many videos on this channel many times, in World War II, there actually already was the Flower class program, the Hunt class program, all sorts of other programs already going. Trawler programs, motor torpedo boats. In fact, pretty much every yard the British could use was already using. One of the interesting things about this scenario was when they paused carrying capital ship construction, and they move people over to the yards to try and support escort production, try and push that forward further. It disrupts the programs which are already going, because they suddenly have to stop their working to train up these people who have come in to work on these smaller ships, when they've been big ship specialists, and B, of course, it stops this. That's a problem. Now, the second issue pausing it creates is, in 1916, in World War I, you could pause because Britain had an unassailable, pretty much, unassailable dominance in terms of capital ships and carriers. Or rather, in terms of capital ships. Carriers didn't exist at that period. In 1939, the British do not. The British have several problems. One, a lot of their ships are older than their American and Japanese counterparts were, which means that when they are sent in for refit, these ships have already served through World War I, have gone through the stresses of World War, then have had 20 years, and are being refitted based on that. So they're going to take longer and require more effort to refit, because their hulls and all the ship has been used more. They have been doing a building program, but it's a crash building program as allowed by the Treasury. Not to maximum Britain's infrastructure capabilities, but the maximum the Treasury is allowed to pay for it, because remember, they've been hoping to avoid war. Britain's been hoping to build up to a capital ship force of 21. That's what they were aiming for. That was their first target, get to 21 and then work out what else was going on around the world. Why 21, you're going to say? It's quite simple. You roughly have squadrons of roughly 7 based in the Mediterranean, in the Indian Ocean, and in the home fleet. And the idea was that they could get to that level by 1942, and that would then be enough to manage the Italian threat, along with, of course, the French. That would be able to enough to deter the Japanese, and it would be enough to manage any German threats. They're also rapidly building new carriers. Britain has a huge number of those under construction. They also are refitting older carriers. They're refitting older battleships. So there are lots of yards which are in the process of working on these big ships. All of that is paused, because Churchill has a brainwave. Or rather, because Churchill remembers what decisions made in World War I. An important decision to get enough escorts into service. There's also a thing forgotten at that point, was that the German Navy had far more submarines at the entry into World War I than it did in the entry into World War II. I've already been over some of the issues they had with their submarines, and that they'd focusing on torpedo firing and gunnery, and were not really doing enough work with the mine laying capacity. They did have some. Please note, I'm not saying they didn't have any, but honestly, in terms of the stats, that's what they should have been pushing in for. But they weren't. The trouble is, aircraft carriers are not just strike systems, and capital ships are not just about fighting other capital ships. They're also tools of deterrence, but but more importantly, tools of security. What do I mean by tools of security? Well, here is the little thing, okay? If you can position your capital ships correctly, you can make it so that certain areas become spaces the enemy fleets cannot pass. If you want to block Gibraltar, and there is a reason why Nelson and Rodney spent quite a lot of their time throughout World War II sitting in Gibraltar to block the Italian fleet from being able to get out of the Mediterranean. If you want to do that, you need those ships there. But if you have Nelson and Rodney sitting there, you don't have them sitting elsewhere. If you want to block the channel, you need some capital ships. If you want to block these spaces, you need some capital ships there. Having carriers is helpful, yes. But in 1939 and even 1940, your carrier may work. It may take out. Remember, there's technologies being rapidly developed, but it's not reached the point of certainty. In 1939, the only certainty you have in the ability to take these things out is your big own hulking capital ships to deal with an opponent's capital ship. So, pausing this construction? Well, this is why the Royal Navy is still using R-class so much, and the well, when I say unenhanced, I'm missing out of it. They have been upgraded to an extent, but not fully reconstructed as many of the Queen Elizabeth, some of the Queen Elizabeths were, the unreconstructed Queen Elizabeths. This is why they have to depend on those ships. This is why there's all that delay in construction. I've had some interesting comments where people go, "Oh, the British can't build battleships. This is why it's taken them so long." And actually, you sort of go, "No. What happens is they pause construction for roughly 6 months, finally persuade Churchill not to unpause construction, and unfortunately, whereas it takes the stroke of a pen and a couple of hours to pause construction, it takes months to restart construction. Especially as in that time, people have had all sorts of ideas, and of course, the treaty limits are no more, and Treasury spending limits are, to an extent, forgotten. So now people can go, "Oh, I have all these cool ideas for these ships." Cool ideas take time to implement, as you have to undo what you've already done, and then do new things. Because people have cool ideas. Does get you a better ship in the end. I will concede that much. But one of the other problems you have in terms of World War II and World War I's legacy is that the British always seem to think they have, and to an extent other powers as well, always seem to think they have more time than they do. And one of those things is time and construction. You need those ships as quickly as possible. You do. Pearl Harbor. Fleet and being is safe in harbour. There were so many times this was proved to be incorrect in World War II. But in World War I, it had been a mantra. It was the entire German strategy. The risk fleet strategy. Their fleet was in harbour. You can't do any operations because they might come out, because of fleet in being. And if they do engage you, they'll cost you enough that you know you'll lose anyway. But the trouble is, it wasn't safe to be in harbour anymore. There were no safe spaces. You can argue that since Copenhagen in the 1800s there hasn't been safe spaces, but no, they still believe there are safe spaces. Even after Taranto, after Mers el Kabir, there were still people who believed there were safe spaces, that some harbours were safe. Ships in harbour can't manoeuvre. Ships in harbour can't fire their guns freely because there are civilian areas and they don't tend to want to bombard their own cities. And also there are other ships, their own allies, their own fellow sisters of their service. They don't want to hit. Ships in harbour are at risk. They're not safe. World War I, they've been safe. And it was meant... I would often argue when some people go with some of the conspiracy theories around Pearl Harbor, and there is a lot of fertile ground for conspiracy theories, I will admit that. But never ascribe to malice that which you can ascribe to stupidity. Or in this case, people using their own memory and history. And them going, well, in World War I they were all safe, you know, when the British were trying to get... Well, of course, the air strikes which they were planning to launch with the Sopwith Cuckoos never took place because the war ended before they could be used. So there's no lesson from World War I about what's coming. It was being developed in World War I, but it lesson hadn't been given. And so people convince themselves based on their own knowledge and their own understanding that they're right, that the fleet is safe there, and therefore that naval officers are just asking for more funding. They're just being hyperbolic. They're just being paranoid. They don't understand the true calculations. Never ascribe to malice and treachery that which you can ascribe to stupidity and ego. Those things come up far more often than the former. Pearl Harbor, the fleet in being ideas, they're a classic example of this. They really are. World War II is littered with examples of this way. And it comes from what happened in World War I and the generation in power looking at World War I and trying to draw their knowledge and experience from World War I. That's what they're doing. But it wasn't just Pearl Harbor, which was some World War I thinking going on. There was also another problem. And I'm going to admit freely that I have picked more examples of the issues from World War I from the Allied and the British spectrum than I have from necessary other powers. The reason I've done this is because, A, there are just so many issues. So many issues with the Germans and the Italians. And the German one, it's, you know, is it the cultural memory of World War I that's led to some of their problems? Is it the Treaty of Versailles? Is it the reality of their situation? And their geographic situation, which World War I hadn't changed, and the limitations going into World War I hadn't changed it. All these options. But there is also another reason. Not just the, the sheer quantity examples and the sort of the moneyness, the extent of picking it out. But there is another reason for also picking on some of the Allies. Because in many ways, the Allied leadership has a lot more leaders who were directly leaders in World War I. The Allied leadership has had a lot less turnover in terms of leadership, in terms of senior people, than the Axis ones. After all, Hitler in World War I was a corporal. In World War II, he's the Führer. It's a promotion level which, frankly, even Napoleon would have been proud of. Whereas in Britain, we have World War One's First Lord of the Admiralty, is First Lord of the Admiralty again, and then becomes Prime Minister. In America, the various senior people involved were all quite senior people involved 20 years ago, 20 years previously. It's a fact that you often have to deal with in terms of winning sides. They won't change their teams. They found an effective team, they're going to stay in power. They're going to stay being useful because they're effective. But that means they're also going to base a lot of their decisions on their experience. Good example of this. Force Z. Where do you deploy it to? Deployed to Singapore, it has to react from Singapore. Deployed to Ceylon, it reacts from Ceylon. True and commonly, probably. If you forward base it at Singapore, you're sending a strong signal to America, to Japan, to Australia, New Zealand, India, that you are taking a front line in defense. Deploy it to Ceylon, you're not sending as strong a signal. Now, here is the problem. You can talk about this one and go, well, it's because of the capital ship and carrier pools that the British don't have enough carriers. That and the losses of Glorious, of Courageous, of Ark Royal, all have added up, and this is why Force Z deploy without an aircraft carrier. And other carriers are in sort of repair, refit, there just aren't enough in service. And you can honestly ask yourself, if the carriers had not been lost, if the carrier construction had not been paused, how many more carriers would have been in service by this point? I would say it's fair to assume at least 3 or 4 more carriers would have been in service by the time of Force Z's deployment than were historically. I think that would be fair. Why? Because Unicorn would probably be in the service. They'd have rushed forward with at least Implacable, if not Indefatigable as well. And all of the Illustrious class would have been in service for quite a while previously. They might well have started on the next generation. Might have been started on light fleet carriers a little bit earlier. Might have. Because, again, this is what's often misunderstood about a pause. The pause has huge repercussions throughout the British shipyard industry. In terms of movement of people and movement of experience, loss of experience, having to rebuild experience, time it takes. It's a decision only someone who is really sure they are right, and they are on the right side of history, will make, because of the disruption it causes. But Force Z's deployment, well, what's this one? Well, if we consider in World War I, some various naval officers had the bright idea of deploying battleships around the world in pairs. Battleships and battle cruisers and cruisers around in penny packets around the world. In World War I, that had shown to be a problem, but also at Falklands, after Coronel, of course, 2 battlecruisers had done the necessary work, had mopped up von Spey's force and shown the power of Britain around the world. What's often forgotten in that analysis is those vessels were part of a task force. There were other cruisers and other vessels with them, including, of course, HMS Glasgow, an earlier version of the one that was in service at this point in World War II. These things were part of history, but they were forgotten. Force Z's deployment, well, they've got destroyers deployed on them. Yes, but you need more than that. You do need the aircraft carrier. You also need the cruisers. You need to build a task force around these ships. The ships on their own are not enough. And that had been shown in World War I. In World War I, consistently, that had been the case. But the trouble is the reporting and the cultural memory of World War I, and even to extend our modern cultural memory of World War II, means that everyone was focusing in on the capital ships, the battleships, the battle cruisers, the high status units, and where they were. And the classic example is when you read books and they say, yes, there was this battleship, this aircraft carrier, this cruiser, and 17 destroyers. The destroyers not have names? Do they have no impact on a battle? They do. We know they do. And this is again the problem with the 4C deployment, because if you consider there are other ships out there. There is Exeter. There are other vessels out there that were spread around. The lesson of World War I had been concentration, but the lesson that was taken away by some of the leadership was very different. If 4C had been a concentration of forces, if all Allied forces, at least all British and British Empire forces, had been concentrated on Singapore to link up with Admiral Phillips and these two units, that would have represented a very powerful force, but it also represented a far safer force for deploying around, because it would have had that level of firepower. Instead of depending upon the firepower of two ships, one of whom danced like anything and was honestly her getting hit, it comes down to bad luck, and the other one was using the latest theories and ideas instead of dancing around for use of her guns, and it would have been better if she'd had some tracer, a lot more tracer. But that's history. Sometimes, or quite often, the good side doesn't win, or even the less bad side doesn't win. And sometimes gambles don't pay off. In fact, quite often they don't. That's why they're called gambles. This was a deployment which is rooted in an idea of the world which had actually been ended by World War I, but which some people had not realized had been ended by World War I. That small deployments can have small deployments will do the necessary requirements. And yeah, these two ships would have been a very, very worrying thing for the Japanese if they'd been deployed with a carrier, if that early decision had been made, if they'd been part of a larger task force. That would have been a major force sitting in Singapore. You can say, well, that would have been threatening. Well, then that's why we position them in Ceylon instead of Singapore. And if you think about it, if they had been positioned in Ceylon, you could have linked them up with the 2R class battleships which are out there. And if you link them up with the 2R class that are out there, well, then you have the ability to go, we have 4 battleships in the area. Yeah, 2RR. But let's be honest, even a modernized Congo doesn't want to tangle with an R-class. Even in the ones which the British had out there, which have been barely upgraded, they'd basically had fire control improvements when they could be. AA defense improvements when they could be. Otherwise, they're in their World War I condition. But they're still battleships, and they're still armed with 15-inch guns. And that's still not something a Congo wants to tangle with. But you move 2 fast ships, 2 prestige assets, a battle cruiser and a fast battleship, to Singapore. You weren't able to gather their supporting forces around them, but you didn't need to, because what matters is the headliners. Nothing else really matters, does it? No one take notice of anything else. Yeah, headliners are important. But a lesson of World War I, which had been forgotten, was headliners don't perform alone. They need the rest of the band along. And the few destroyers they had with them did a jolly good job. But they weren't enough of a band for the mission they were sent on. Classic case in point is tribal class destroyers. The exact destroyer which you probably should have sent out there in terms of their firepower and capabilities, but they are in far greater demand in the home fleet and in the Mediterranean. And so they're not spared. The larger fleet destroyers, nowhere to be found in this deployment. And as we said at the beginning, the larger destroyers were more useful for World War II because of their greater capability. They're more, well, they are far more of a multi-use tool than the smaller destroyers. Because they can be. Because they have the space and the crew to be. Not because there's anything better about those crew in terms of, you know, Elan or anything like that. Although, to be fair, the Tribals did have plenty of that going with them as well. But it's more a case of, if you're deploying in smaller forces around the world, you need individual ships to be more capable. You're not able to deploy, rely upon mass for your deployment. You need the individual muscle. This is an individual deployment. This is straight out of the Royal Navy's post-World War II thinking. Post-World War I thinking, sorry, apologies. But the Royal Navy in post-World War I had always talked about them being in task forces. That's why they experimented with large destroyers post-World War I. That's why they experimented with all sorts of things post-World War I. They were looking at them because of their thinking about these deployments and building those combined task forces. Ah, the graphs bay. This is probably not the video which people expected me to produce. I can understand that. It may be popular, it may not be, but I wanted to produce a video which made people think. The big thing I want you to be thinking about now is how our perception of events can affect our approach to current and future events. The mistakes in World War II are mostly based on people acting from perceptions of World War I or experience of World War I without actually looking at what was actually happening. Cancelling or pausing the capital ship and carrier program is understandable if there wasn't already an escort program in place. But the moment there is already an escort program in place, you have to ask yourself, well, why are you cancelling it? Just to say you're doing something, okay, but what war are we fighting? And you can make the case, well, you know, against Germany, they didn't need more capital ships because they had more than enough. Yeah, but the more capital ships weren't being built because of worries about Germany. Germany had a tiny capital ship force, and frankly, the Royal Navy wasn't worried about them at this point. And I don't think they were ever arguably really worried about them until the Germans theoretically had a strength in faster ships. The British were always, well, especially the Royal Navy, but the British as a whole were always more worried about the other factors. Italy, that's a problem. France falling, that's a problem. Those are all things which could be handled a lot better if you didn't have a paused capital ship and carrier program. Some of the carriers might have actually ended service. One of them, potentially. Probably not before the fall of France, but not long after. So, again, the losses from Norway could have been far more quickly made good. But more importantly, if you need to put together a fleet to hold the Eastern Mediterranean and the Western Mediterranean and the North Sea and North Atlantic from Germany and Italy, because Italy's divided your fleet in half and you no longer got the French fleet sitting in the Western Mediterranean, then you're going to need a lot more capital ships. If we think about it, the British only have superiority for a very short amount of time in terms of capital ship numbers over the Italians. They capitalized it on every time and every chance they achieve it, but they only have it for a short amount of time, and that drives a lot of British policy throughout World War II. However, if the King George V had ended service quicker, well, there are things that could have been changed. Parts of history which would have certainly been very different. Combine that with some carriers entering service more quickly, and again, things can be very different very quickly. Very different and very quickly. You have that Illustrious is commissioned in May 1940. She was laid down in April 1937. Formidable was laid down in June 1937. She's launched in August 1939, is in case of Formidable. So she's laid down 2 months after Illustrious. She's launched 4 months after Illustrious. And she commissions 6 months after Illustrious. Almost to the day. Falling behind 2 months at every point. You can't really blame the stuff prior to September 1939. But in the case of Victorious, she's built also by Vickers, as was Illustrious, but she's built at Wallsend rather than Barrow and Furness. She's laid down May 1937. Launched September 1939, so 4 months later, in fact, 4 months and a few days later, she's launched. She's not commissioned till May 1941. Now, if we consider the other 2 vessels, which, if you're considering Illustrious, is April to May 1940, so that is 13 months pretty much. And Formidable, August 1939 to November 1940. Well, that's 15 months. Victorious is September to May, September 1939 to May 1941. That's 19 months. We won't even get into Indomitable, which is built in Barrow and Furness Vickers Armstrong, same as Illustrious is. Laid down November 1937. Launched March 1940. Commissioned October 1941. And that's the aircraft carriers, not the battleships. We only have to look at America and what they go through in terms of their construction program, watching World War II starting and taking place, watching from the sidelines, learning as many lessons they can to try and implement their construction, how many delays that builds into their construction. Truly, therefore, we have to think through all these things. You know, one of the big impact of World War I on World War II is the amount of things it's drawn from in order to make decisions in World War II. And that leads to a lot of issues. Because World War I is not World War II. You can argue that in terms of its global nature, World War II has more in common with the 7 Years' War than it does with World War I. World War I is a global war, it is a world war, but it certainly isn't of the scale in terms of campaigns and the importance of those global campaigns as World War I and II is. But there again, a theme I've hopefully returned to a lot in this video. Just because they're different doesn't necessarily mean that World War I was the worst place for the leaders of the various powers to draw the lessons from in planning for World War II. And it was probably the only place they had an option of. Saying that leads to a question. Which war do you think that World War I's leaders drew their lessons from? Most, I'm guessing, in terms of the French, will be going for the Franco-Prussian War, and the same with the Germans, but there are other wars there, and there are other wars you can make the case for. Be interesting to see what you'll say in the comments. Right, what have we got coming up? We have a lot coming up. Viewer suggestions free is the Tuesday video. It's still a surprise. That's because, honestly, I've got two options in mind and I haven't decided which one I'm going with. But I'll be recording it Saturday, so I'll find out then. And then we've got the story of land ships coming up in September and winning a war. Hosendorf and unrestricted submarine warfare. Might explain where quite a lot of the conversation about mine warfare came from today. It's good stuff. He's an interesting commander. And next week, well, we have the British capture of Trincomalee and its consequences, and on Brew Ships 122, we have building the wooden wall. We have all sorts of discussions about building wooden warships, coming up with the books that are key to understanding it. There has been a newer book produced by Pen and Sword recently, but I haven't managed to get a decent copy of it on Kindle, and that's just not the same to read. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. Hey, by gum.